In 1665, the plague was raging throughout Europe. And so the one method of mitigation they had back then was social distancing. So for the 1665-66 academic year, all universities in Britain were closed down. And so Isaac Newton, as a young assistant professor at Cambridge University, did what all professors are supposed to do during the time of closure, social distancing, and went home and sat under an apple tree and thought about deep thoughts about life, the universe, and everything. And as he would say later, a thought came to him occasioned by the fall of an apple. And what happened was, he saw the moon rising in the sky, and he saw an apple falling from the top of an apple tree. And the thought came to him, what if the same force that pulled this apple from the top of the tree could reach all the way up to the moon and be pulling the moon around the earth? So he quickly did some calculations of the strength of the force that was pulling the apple from the tree, and knowing the distance of the moon from the earth and the orbital period, he did some calculations, and sure enough, it turned out that the exact same force was responsible for both. This was really the first time that motion of the heavens and motion of the earth was connected. If you go back to Aristotle, you have the four elements on earth, and you have the quintessence, the fifth element of the heavens, and the two never met. But with Newton, he combined the actions of motion on earth with the motions in the heavens, and developed one force that explained them, and called that force gravity. So, as we are undergoing social distance now, it's a good idea to think about deep thoughts of life, the universe, and everything, and maybe you too can develop a law of gravity. So when we look at Newton's life, we find that he was a physicist, he was a mathematician, he was an alchemist, he was a theologian, he was a student of Bible prophecy. And historically, in the past, when people have written biographies of Newton, they just concentrated on his mathematics and his physics, and ignored the rest, even though he wrote a lot more about theology than he did about physics or mathematics. It's only been recently that people have looked at his entire life and discovered that truly to understand Newton, you have to understand him as a theologian first and foremost. Everything else then builds from his theology. So he was a voluntarist, which means that he believed that God had the choice in how to create. And since God had choices, we couldn't just sit in a room and think about what a perfect creation is and say, well, that's how creation happened. Instead, you have to go out and do the experiments, look at nature, and figure out what methods God used to create. And so he was a physicist in order to understand God's methods of creation. He was a mathematician because mathematics is language with which we understand the universe. He was a student of biblical prophecy because he wanted to see how God has interacted with humans throughout history, and the prophetic word is one way to see how God has directly interacted with humans. He was an alchemist because he wanted to see how God is continuing his creation, and the idea of seeing how God is continually creating and sustaining the world, he tried to study through the alchemy. So everything is tied into his theological background. And so what we see is it's Newton's theology, particularly about God having the voluntary choice of creating the world, and then once he had made that choice, have various options in how to create the world, that we have to go out and experimentally determine how he did that creation. And likewise, he understood theologically that humans are fallen, finite creatures. And so therefore, the idea of reproducibility in science is of paramount importance, because it's easy to fool yourself. In fact, you are the easiest person for you to fool. It's much more difficult to fool other people than to fool yourself. And so as a scientist, he understood that, and so understood the necessity of having repeatable measurements and having other people that could repeat that and reproduce the experiments. And this is how the whole scientific method as we understand it today came about. So Newton published very little during his lifetime. So much of what we know about Newton's writings actually came to light after his death. And particularly with regard to prophetic interpretation, nothing of what he wrote was ever published in his lifetime. But shortly after his death, a compilation of his writings was published in 1728 called The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms. In this book, Newton lays out the history of the Babylonian and Medo-Persian kingdoms and the Greek kingdoms afterwards, and laying out the events that occurred during all of these kingdoms. And it was actually during this study that Newton came out with a date that's very important for Adventist prophetic interpretation, which is the 457 BC date for the reestablishment of Jerusalem, because this is the date that starts the 70 weeks prophecies that leads to Christ's first coming and all of that. But this was very much established by Newton. So since Newton's day, nobody has ever really challenged this 457 BC date, because Newton laid down this date firmly. A second book that was published in 1733, 6 years later, is Daniel and the Apocalypse. Its title is Observations upon the Prophecies of Daniel and the Apocalypse of St. John. And in this book, Newton claims that Daniel is the key to understanding all biblical prophecy. And so the vast majority of the book is laid down in interpreting all the prophetic texts of Daniel, such as the 1260 days and the 2300 days, and sets out a historicist interpretation. And so we see in this very close similarities to that of Adventist perspective. For instance, the 1260 days that he talks about, he emphasizes this 1260 days is the ascendance of the secular power of papal Rome. And so he looked at the dates and said, okay, well, the ascendancy came in the year 800 AD, and you add to that, you get 2060 AD. And so he made a statement that the second coming of Christ would not occur before the year 2060. So as we approach that date, you'll see more and more people talking about Newton's prediction of the end of the world in 2060. That's not quite true. He just said that the end of the world would not come before 2060. Now, when William Miller came along 200 years later and looked around, his interpretation of the 1260 days was exactly the same, in that this was the ascendancy of the papal power, the secular power of papal Rome. But he looked around and said, well, that's over, because it's not ascendant now. It ended in 1798 with Napoleon taking the Pope hostage. And so he then worked the dates backwards to find an earlier date to start the prophecies. So there's a difference between the Adventist interpretation and Newton's interpretation as far as the starting and ending date of the 1260-day prophecy, but the interpretation is exactly Newtonian. So when we look at the Adventist interpretation, we see that we owe a lot to Newton's interpretation, even if some of the dates don't exactly correspond to what Newton had. So the history of these manuscripts of Newton is quite interesting. After Newton died, the heirs to his estate donated his entire collection of writings to Cambridge University, where he was the professor for many, many years. Cambridge took all of his mathematical writings and all of his physics writings, but they looked at all of his theological writings, prophetic writings, and alchemical writings, and said, these are not important, we don't want them. And so these writings stayed in a trunk for 200 years. Finally, in 1938, the heirs said, we really have to dispose of these, and so they were sold in a Sotheby's auction. It was a trunk full of manuscripts. The entire set of manuscripts brought in about £10,000 total. It was only after the sale that many different people had collected them and were starting to read them that their importance was discovered. And so two very wealthy men, John Maynard Keynes, the economist, and Abraham Yehuda, the Jewish theologian, said, we need to preserve these and we need to gather them together. So they started buying up the manuscripts. Well, during that time, Leroy Froom, the Adventist historian, was writing his 4-volume epic work on the prophetic faith of our fathers. And he was going through and looking at all of the background of the prophetic interpretation. And he came upon the writings of Newton and decided this was something important. Well, he traveled all around the world looking for documents. And he found this 40-page document of Isaac Newton's. It's a 40-page folio called The Prophecies Concerning Christ's Second Coming. And he paid about £10,000 for it. This was in the mid-1940s. And so this is the document right here. Now, it's in 5 sheets. So what it was each of these sheets was folded in 4. So it was folded horizontally and folded vertically. And so to read it, you would have to fold it and unfold it. Well, this was written in 1680. So this is 300 plus years old. And so obviously, we don't want to keep folding and unfolding it, so that's why it's in the mylar sheath, and we see this. So it's 5 sheets, each one of which is 8 pages to give the 40-page folio. And so this is part of the library that Leroy Froom accumulated as he was developing these books. Then when the seminary moved to Andrews University in 1960, this document was moved to Andrews University at that time. And so it now exists in the vault of the Center for Adventist Research here in the basement of the James White Library. And it's only brought out from the vault on special occasions like this one for people to see. However, you can go online on the Digital Commons site for Andrews University and actually read the entire document. Now, obviously, for researchers, they need to have access to all of Newton's works. And so a few years ago, Cambridge University established the Newton Project, where they went and scanned and digitized every single manuscript that they could find of Isaac Newton's. And now that is available, and this manuscript is one of those that's digitized, so that students of Newton can now go and look at all of his writings and see all of his work on biblical prophecy, all of his work on alchemy, as well as all of his work on physics and mathematics. This actual document is titled Prophecies Concerning Christ's Second Coming. And so what Newton has done here is gone through all of the biblical texts that talk about the second coming of Christ, the biblical texts talking about the coming of Elijah, and other texts to compile in one place the entirety of the text that he's interested in. This is a very methodical and very thorough work, but that's the way he was in all of his writings. In his work in physics or his work in theology or biblical prophecy, he was very thorough and very methodical in how he did his work. And so you could say that his training in physics was very, very helpful in order to develop new thought in the theological and prophetic interpretation realm. We don't know the exact influence that Newton had on William Miller. We have some inferences. For instance, his book on the prophecies of Daniel and the Apocalypse was in William Miller's library. We also know that one of William Miller's sons was named Isaac Newton Miller. But there apparently was a significant influence either directly from Newton's writings or from others who had followed Newton's writings to help Miller in developing the Adventist interpretation of biblical prophecy, particularly in the book of Daniel. So Isaac Newton can be considered the father of physics and one of the main fathers of modern empirical science, but in many respects, he is also the father of Adventism. Even though he died 100 years before William Miller developed the Adventist interpretation of prophecy, it's his work that led directly into the Adventist interpretation. And this work was recognized by Leroy Froom. He spent 12 pages of his volumes of the prophetic faith of our fathers just talking about Isaac Newton. And not only that, he had artwork commissioned for the frontispiece of the volumes that prominently display Isaac Newton. That artwork hung for many years in the GC headquarters in Tacoma Park, Maryland. However, when the headquarters moved from there to Silver Spring, the artwork disappeared, and we don't know where that artwork is. However, we found a high-definition PDF of that artwork, and we've been able to reproduce it. And so that original artwork from 1949 now hangs outside the Office of Research in Buller Hall here at Andrews University. When people think about the relationship between science and religion today, often it is in the realm of conflict. That is, theology says one thing, science says something else, and they're in conflict with each other. And so the challenge is resolving that conflict. But historically, that is not the way theology and science developed. And Isaac Newton is a good case in point. The modern method of empirical science that we have now was not a method that was developed by atheists. It's a method that was developed by staunch Christians such as Isaac Newton. That is, that it's the Christian who expects to see order and regularity in nature because it is created. And so they expect to see the created order because there was a creator. And so, therefore, historically, modern empirical science originated amongst Christians. And so that's helpful as we look at conflicts that occur between science and theology nowadays. To the point of, one philosopher has stated that there is a superficial conflict between science and religion, but a deep underlying accord between science and religion. And likewise, there's a superficial accord between naturalism and science, but a deep underlying conflict between naturalism and science. And so Newton allows us to go back and look at the fundamentals of the establishment of science to find that deep underlying accord. And so when you think about the conflicts, it's good always to keep in mind this deep underlying accord. And then the conflicts are not quite as important.